Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and with us is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, always great to talk with you.
Brandon, a joy to be on with you as always.
Hey, we're still here in the beginning of the new year, and I forgot to ask you in the last episode, as we kick off 2017, do you have any goals or resolutions for the new year?
Goals are, I've never really been a big New Year's resolution kind of guy. I just got through a retreat. You know, you think I would have made a lot of spiritual resolutions. I suppose I did talk, about deepening my own prayer life, spending more time with the Lord, trying to get my life in better order. It's because I'm trying to keep all these things balanced, of my work in the region, my work in LA, my work around the country, my work with Word on Fire. So I suppose that's kind of a resolution, is to get my life in some better order.
Now, when you first became bishop, I remember, and I don't know if we talked about this on the show or not, but you asked Archbishop Gomez during one of your first trips out to your new region, what do you want me to do here? Like, what are your goals for me here? And what did he tell you?
Yeah, it was he thought for about 20 seconds maybe. And then he said, I want you to be present to the people. I want you to give them hope, and I want you to teach them doctrine. And so I've taken that very seriously. I think being present to the people is huge. Was it Woody Allen said, 80% of life is showing up? There's a lot to that. I mean, you show up at things. So this morning I said Mass at 7 o'clock with the Poor Clares out here in Santa Barbara. Tomorrow I'm doing a funeral Mass for a young deacon who died. I go to schools and to parishes and confirmations. So being present, that's a big part of it. And then giving hope. LA, the last 10, 15 years has gone through a rough time. And so be a beacon, a spokesperson for hope. And then thirdly, teach doctrine, which is kind of my thing. I've been teaching doctrine for most of my life. And I'm happy to do that, to be a teacher. So I don't just show up and say nice, friendly things, but I hope I have something substantive to say about the Catholic faith. So I've taken those three charges seriously.
Now, in this episode, we're going to turn to a topic that you and I love, and I know a lot of our listeners love because they're always asking us about it. It's books. I'd like to spend some time talking about some different titles that you're reading, what's on your mind, what sorts of things are you thinking about. So let's look at a few books that have been on your plate recently. The first one is a classic book that's just been re-released. It's called Liturgy and Personality. It's written by Dietrich von Hildebrand, and you wrote the foreword for this book. We'll have a link to your foreword below this podcast at wordonfireshow.com. But let's start off by asking a simple question. Who is Dietrich von Hildebrand? Why does he matter?
Yeah, one of the great Catholic philosophers of the 20th century. Von Hildebrand was a convert to the Catholic faith. He was the son of a very accomplished German artist, sculptor, and painter. He was born in Florence, a great place to be born. Came of age speaking both Italian and German. Then educated in Germany. He falls under the influence of the circle around Edmund Husserl. So there he's very much like Edith Stein. In fact, he knew Edith Stein quite well. Max Scheler comes to mind. Max Scheler, on whom Karl Wojtyła wrote his doctoral dissertation. They were all part of the circle around Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. And so then von Hildebrand becomes a Catholic. That's another part of his story. And then writes the same way Edith Stein did, trying to reconcile classical Catholic thought with phenomenology, and produced some wonderful works prior to World War II. But he became Hitler's enemy number one, and we say it to his infinite credit. At one point, Hitler himself said, "This is the guy I am most down on." So God bless him, And long story short, he was chased out of Europe by the Nazis, and he ends up in New York at Fordham University, where he taught for many years. He dies, I think, in 73 or early 1970s, I think. Wrote a remarkable book after the council, kind of assessing the work of the council, and some wonderful books, including this one, which is kind of a little gem, I think, called Liturgy and Personality. If you want to get your introduction to von Hildebrand, get his book called Transformation in Christ, based on lectures he gave to committed lay people back in the that awful period when Hitler was sort of coming to power. And von Hildebrand wrote these lyrically beautiful and deep, searching essays on the Christian life. Anyway, he's emerged as kind of a hero of mine over the years, and I have great admiration for this little book. And so when they asked me to write the preface for a new edition, I was delighted.
This book is a pretty accessible introduction to von Hildebrand. It's not too thick. It's only 120, 130 pages. But it was written in 1933 at the height of the so-called liturgical movement in Europe and America. Talk about that. What was that all about?
Oh, yeah. Someone like Romano Guardini comes to mind. Like von Hildebrand there, someone who combined the Italian and the German cultures. Guardini over there, Karl Adam in Europe. In our country, people like Reinhold Hillenbrand, not to be confused with Dietrich von Hildebrand. There's Reinhold Hillenbrand, who was the rector of Mundelein Seminary. Think of Virgil Michael. Think of Godfrey Diekmann in our country. All people who are leading the charge for a renewal of the liturgy. Their theology was rooted very much in the 19th century in this recovery of the mystical body theology. Think, by the way, a book. Now, Brandon, you and I both wrote, either I forget who wrote what, the foreword, the afterword, to Sheen's great book on the mystical body. That book participates very much in this same movement, a desire to recover the mystical body theology, and these people to put the liturgy very much in that context. Liturgy and social justice is one side of it. Liturgy and spiritual transformation is another. And I think von Hildebrand's book is closer to that side of the equation.
You might say that the principal point of this book, Liturgy and Personality, is that the church decisively shapes a healthy personality. What does that mean, and how does it do that?
Yeah, it's a very important thing to make a distinction, because he'll use the word personality. And we think, oh, he's a personality, someone with a lot of pizzazz, or he should be on TV. That guy's a personality. Well, he doesn't mean that. In fact, he thinks that's the wrong thing to become. By a well-cultivated personality, von Hildebrand means someone who's been formed to appreciate objective value. And that's his great term. It's Wert in German, W-E-R-T, worth. Our word comes from that. The objectively valuable is distinguished from the merely subjectively satisfying, right? So I like spaghetti, you like pork chops. Okay, we find that subjectively satisfying, but no one's going to reorganize his life around those desires. We intuit that those are, private, ephemeral, subjective. However, within the world, and here's his phenomenological side, there are these realities that we call the objectively valuable. These are things that are so striking in their goodness, truth, or beauty that they organize us around themselves, if that makes sense. I don't bring them into my personality. Rather, I'm shaped around them. They make a claim on me. They enter and reorganize my interiority, if any of that is making sense. But think of, a work of art. Think of a person. Think of a song. Think of a symphony that has so impressed you with its objective value that you're now changed by it and you become a missionary of it. See? Now, a personality that's well formed is someone that knows how to respond properly to objective value. Now, we could say in a more trivial way, someone with good taste. That's not getting at the depth of it, but you see the idea. Someone who's got a very superficial taste, they don't know how to react to profound objective value. They might, see the most trivial work of art and they go into ecstasy over it. That's not a well-trained personality. His point now with this book is that the liturgy plays a role in the shaping of one's personality. It makes of us much better appreciators of the objectively valuable. That's, I think, the main point of the book.
So that book was Liturgy and Personality by Dietrich von Hildebrand. And again, we have links to that book and all the rest at wordonfireshow.com underneath this episode. Let's look at another book. You've been raving about this one for quite some time. It's another slender book, but it's a conversion memoir recently published by Ignatius Press titled Night's Bright Darkness. It's written by Sally Reed. Tell us about her and her story.
Yeah, I knew almost nothing about her until my friend Paul Murray, the great Dominican spiritual writer, said to me, there's this book by this woman, and Paul knew her because Paul's based in Rome, and she was in Rome for a time. And he said, she's the real deal. I remember he said, read her book and you'll get it.
And that's meaningful coming from Father Paul Murray.
Yes, quite right. And so when the book did arrive from Ignatius Press, that's the one that Paul Murray talked about. And yes, it's one of these stories that has kind of an Augustinian arc to it. Someone who was about as far from the faith as you could imagine, and then making her slow and painful, fascinating way to the Catholic faith. She was and is a poet, and a very fine poet. She had been a very committed feminist, a very committed secularist, let's say. Sympathetic with the new atheists and very suspicious of religion. And the book is about how she comes, without abandoning her poetry. I think the poetry in some ways is the golden thread. Without abandoning the poetry, she comes to Catholic faith. I'll tell you the scene that strikes me the most. It's the very beginning of the book. I think she means it to stay in her reader's mind. She, at one point in her career, was a nurse, and she's going through her training, and it's come to the point where how to deal with a dead body. So someone who's just died, and someone's got to prepare that body to be, transferred to the morgue or wherever it was. So there she was with an older, very experienced Irish nurse. I think she was in London at the time, in a London hospital. This is an Irish nurse. And she's giving her the instructions, showing her the ropes of how to deal with this body. And it's all full of the technical language of science and, all this. And then when she was all finished, the Irish nurse opened the window. And then she said, in the same tone of voice, now we'll let his soul fly away. And it struck her as like, what in the world? Because she was at home with all the science, objective, medical kind of terminology. And then suddenly, without missing a beat, without changing the tone of voice, the nurse said, now we let his soul fly away. And it's one of those moments that kind of teases you out of your worldview. It's not an argument, obviously. It's not appealing to the mind so much. But it's a little poke, a little nudge. It's a little suggestion that maybe something else might be the case. And I think she means that little episode to be sort of a leitmotif as she moves through the story, because what she discovers, and a lot of people discover on the way to the faith, is the sciences, for all their virtues, and they're full of virtues, but the sciences don't answer our deepest questions. And there's a scientism that purposely blocks or buries those questions. They're just irrelevant. They're childish. They're whatever. And I think that little episode with the nurse was meant to say, no, there are questions that science can't begin to answer. And that starts her on her journey.
Theologians and evangelists talk often about the via pulchritudinis, the way of beauty as a path to God. And, you and I are both huge fans of rational arguments. I don't want to belittle those at all. Yeah. But when you read this book, you find a woman who was drawn to the faith through the church's beauty, through the literary tradition. Yeah. She discovers, importantly, the great mystics like St. John of the Cross, and it reminded me of other converts like Thomas Merton who came down that path. Yep. What do you think today in our culture? Talk about that as a route of access to God. Sometimes the arguments, as valid and sound as they are, just don't land on people the way that they have in the past. So talk about opening up these other routes like mysticism or poetry or beauty.
I've told my students for years, we got to be very flexible, and we have to be soul doctors with a lot of different medicines in our little black bag, if you're doing the work of apologetics or theology and you've only got one type of medicine in your bag, that's not going to work because it'll work for some people. Like when I was a little kid, 14 years old, and was deeply impressed by the Aquinas argument, well, heck, there were all kinds of other 14-year-olds in that room that day who were completely unimpressed by it. Maybe they weren't listening, or maybe they were listening and thought, yeah, all right. But it's saying to me, okay, I get that. Good. And I followed that path like mad. But it won't sing to everybody. I'll tell you, when I was reading her book, in fact, I reread sections of it to try, what was the moment when she crossed over? I'm always fascinated by that. So you hate the faith. By the end of the book, you love the faith. So let's find it. What was the moment when you kind of crossed over? And in her book, it's very hard to find. In my experience of the Aquinas thing, I can pinpoint it. Merton pinpoints it. Remember in the 7-Story Mountain when he reads Etienne Gilson was an absolute turning point. And there was more of an intellectual insight, though, as you say, Merton is more attuned to the Platonic sort of poetic tradition. With her, it was less obvious, but I think it's now Newman comes to play, right? The illative sense that guides us as we assess a whole range of experiences, hunches, intuitions, arguments, etc., and you come to assent. How's that happen? Everyone's different. And I think as an apologist or an evangelist, you got to be flexible. You got to be like a tennis player who's lithe enough to move with the ball. If you're just standing there like, I can hit one shot, great. When the ball comes right to that little alleyway, you'll be great. But you got to range over that whole court. And people respond in very different ways to this question.
So I encourage listeners, pick up this book, Night's Bright Darkness, A Modern Conversion Story by Sally Reed. It's fairly short. It's only 150 pages or so, but it's not just a good story. It's so beautifully written. If you look at some of the endorsements on the back, you'll find words like luminous, profound, gripping, enchanting, and those aren't exaggerated, I think. It's one of the most beautiful conversion stories I've read. Let's turn our attention, Bishop, to a third book here. A couple months ago, you paid a visit to Rick Warren. Rick Warren, of course, is the pastor of Saddleback Church out there in California, which is one of the largest evangelical Protestant churches in the country. Rick is also the author of The Purpose-Driven Life, which is the mega best-selling book. I think it's up to like 40 million copies sold, something like that. Yeah, it's crazy. Somebody told me, I'm not sure if this is accurate, but they said it's the best-selling nonfiction religious book in English history. So I don't know how you handle that mantle walking around with that.
I think he told me that.
Okay.
I think he told me that when I met him, but I believe it.
So, but I don't want to talk about that one. Maybe we'll do another podcast on that book. But one title that, I don't know if he got you to read it or if you picked it up on your own, but you've been browsing through it. It's called The Purpose-Driven Church. The Purpose-Driven Church. Talk about this book.
Yeah, no, I read it quite carefully because he gave it to me when I visited him. I had read The Purpose-Driven Life, and he autographed that, and he autographed the second one for me. So I had the book on my desk, and I went away, as you mentioned, to Yosemite around Thanksgiving time. I had a few days. And I brought it with me, and I read it with great interest. And I liked it very much. He's an evangelical Protestant. I'm a Catholic bishop, so we have certain differences when it comes to ecclesiology and theology. Nevertheless, there's a lot in there, I think, that Catholics can benefit from. And that basic idea of a church that has to have a purpose, and it might sound obvious, but I don't think that is for a lot of people. We're a Catholic parish, and we do our basic thing here. But like, what's the point of this parish? Where's it going? What's the purpose of it? And I think it's very useful that he's brought that to the fore. And he organizes his things thinking along the lines of the great commandment of Jesus and the great commission of Jesus, right? So the commandment is to love God, love your neighbor. From that, he's going to get liturgy, worship. There's the love of God. That's got to be central to a church. That you do Sunday well, that you worship the Lord. Secondly, love your neighbor. That's all those forms of outreach to the poor. It's the pastoral, the apostolic work, right? But then you've got the Great Commission, the end of the gospel. Jesus says, "Go and announce the gospel to all nations." Well, from the Great Commission, you get the evangelizing purpose of a church. It yes shapes disciples, yes it draws people in to worship God, but then finally it's meant to send them out to evangelize. I just thought it was a useful way to think about the life of a church. So I enjoyed that very much.
Some of these evangelical mega churches are often stereotyped or criticized for being all about drawing new people in, for being about growth, 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 and having a huge number of seekers attracted to your church. But Rick, if you read this book, he emphasizes that the issue is not church growth, but the issue is church health, and that if your church is healthy, then it will grow naturally. And he says that for a healthy church, the result of a healthy church is that you've balanced these 5 principles. You've hinted at a couple of them already, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on them, but I wanted to get your thoughts on them. I'm going to list them out here. He says that a healthy church will follow this 5-part strategy. It will grow warmer through fellowship, deeper through discipleship, stronger through worship, broader through ministry, and then larger through evangelism. Talk about that pattern or that strategy.
Yeah, well, that's it. That's the Great Command, the Great Commission. So the fellowship thing, there's the invitation. And that's when the church opens its arms wide. It doesn't put a lot of pressure on people and makes the worship experience as user-friendly as possible. One thing that Rick said, both personally when I was with him and in the book, that, in California here, he never wears a coat and tie. Because he's Southern California. The weather's always nice. So he wears the, short sleeve shirt and call me Rick. He doesn't never call me doctor or pastor, So there's that welcoming thing, the fellowship, come on in. But then, as you suggest, he's very quick to say, that's not the end, that's the beginning. So the church ended with that, like, hey, everyone's welcome, come on in, isn't it great? Our numbers are going up. Well, who cares in some ways? Once they're in, now they've got to be shaped. Now there's your discipleship. There's growth in prayer, growth in intimacy with the Lord. There's Bible study. There's, we would say theology and that sort of thing. But then there's the ministry. Ministry is the love your neighbor. So go out, you got to do something, help the poor, identify those in need in your community. So ministry. And see, once you're in, if you say, okay, I'm part of this church, well, he starts putting pressure on you. You got to make sure you're signed up for Bible study. Make sure you're signed up for a course in prayer or whatever. Then make sure you're signed up for one of our ministries. You got to be involved in it. You can't just talk about it, watch other people do it. You got to be involved. Then worship. So we said there's the first great commandment, love the Lord your God. How fully involved are you now in the worship of this church? Do you come on a regular basis? We Catholics would say, you're obligated to come. Do we hold Catholics to that? How often do we preach it? Do we demand it? And then finally, there's the evangelical move. Like, okay, now that you've been drawn into fellowship, you've been shaped in discipleship, you've been sent to take care of the poor, you've been drawn into worship, now off you go. You become an evangelizer. So that's the purpose-driven church, has those dynamics always in mind.
You got to spend a day with Rick Warren, and then again, you read this book. After all that time, what would you say that Catholic parishes and Catholic pastors should take away from the model of Rick's Saddleback and the purpose-driven church?
Yeah, I think a lot. I mean, go back to a book like Rebuilt that came out a few years ago, which is written by a couple of Catholics. I think one a priest and one a layman. But they're taking some of the insights of the megachurch people. And one of theirs has stayed with me is on that welcoming fellowship front, to even have ministers in the parking lot that are helping people come in, to make the initial experience as positive and welcoming as possible, to take care of the kids. They're very big on that the minute a family shows up, that their kids are being cared for, et cetera. So I get that. I think that's something that Catholics can learn from, that we have our mind set on the nuns, right, on those who have drifted away. I also think we can benefit from this tougher, harder-edged approach to our own people. How often do we as Catholics say, okay, someone's coming to Mass, good enough. They're given their envelope every week. Okay, good enough. Well, is that good enough? Do we really monitor how people are growing in holiness and discipleship? Do we make the expectation that, hey, why aren't you at Bible study? Why aren't you at, that retreat, etc.? Do we oblige all of our people to be involved in ministry, and not just through the collection, as important as that is? And do we send our people out as evangelists? I think there's a certain complacency about a lot of Catholic parishes, and that can be challenged legitimately by a book like this.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from one of our listeners. Today we have a question from Harrison. Harrison's listened to some of our episodes before and has heard you, Bishop, talk about the non-competitive transcendence of God, and he's got a question about what that implies. So here's Harrison's question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Harrison from Duke University, North Carolina. My question is, if God exists non-competitively with mankind, like the burning bush, and only has love for mankind, his creation, why was it that God rained down fire upon Sodom in the way that, say, a Roman or Greek god would? Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. And you're raising actually a complex series of questions there. I'll say a couple simple things. One is, when reading the Bible, one must always be attentive to what I call themes, patterns, and trajectories. Because what you can do is take something out of the Bible and you can argue for or prove pretty much anything. If you take one passage, one story, one image, and you isolate it, you can prove anything you want. And so it's never a question of that, but themes, patterns, and trajectories. The ultimate trajectory of the entire Bible is toward Christ crucified and risen. And now we see in the book of Revelation that we read the whole Bible, right? The scroll has the 7 seals. Think of that as the scroll of the Bible. It's opened by the Lamb standing as though slain. It's opened by the nonviolent, crucified and risen Christ. And that means we should read the whole Bible under that rubric. So how then do we read stories like Sodom and Gomorrah, etc.? Well, the church fathers tend to read them as metaphors there of God's cleansing. So not so much God falling into a snit, like, as you say, the Greek and Roman gods. God, he got so mad that he just lost his temper and decided to destroy that city. But God's anger in the Bible is always expressive of God's desire to purify and to set things right. So the prophets will speak of God's anger. The Psalms speak of God's anger. They don't mean he's falling into an emotional state. They mean his love is seeking to right the wrong of sin. And that can often look like a purifying fire. That'd be a very quick answer now to your subtle, really set of questions there.
Well, thanks for listening to this book talk related episode of the Word on Fire show. If you visit wordonfireshow.com and click on this episode, you'll find links to all the books that we've just discussed, along with some other articles and videos there as well. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.